Hello and welcome back to A Better World. This is your host, Mitchell J. Rabin, and we're going to have another very interesting show today. I have invited back Jean Houston, who has been a guest on A Better World several times, and her co-author of a really interesting book that we'll be focused on today, and its inherent life and principles, Anneloes Smitsman from Mauritius. So we have come together today to discuss this increasingly popular book called The Human Futures Trilogy, The Quest of Rose. And it's really taking a peek into the future from our present and sort of creates a space of possibility of what we as a species can become. And God knows we need some kind of hope for that at this point in time. A little bit about today's guests. Jean Houston, PhD, is a world-renowned scholar, futurist, and researcher in human capacities, human potential, social change, and systemic transformation. She's one of the principal founders of the human potential movement. She became very, very well known internationally for that work and is one of the foremost visionary thinkers and doers of our time. She's also founder of the field of social artistry, human development in the light of social change, and she's taken her work literally all over the world to some 100 countries. She has worked with the United Nations, with NASA, as well as working with global leaders in leading institutions. She's the author of some 35 books and many more unpublished to date. Dr. Anneloes Smitsman, PhD, is a visionary scientist, published author, pianist, futurist, systems architect, and leadership catalyst for the transition to a thrivable civilization. She is the founder and CEO of Earthwise Center. She holds a master's degree in law and judicial political sciences, and she has a doctorate degree from the Maastricht Sustainability Institute in Maastricht University in the Netherlands. So it's a true pleasure to have you both on today to discuss this latest work of yours. Well, together, it's the first time you've pioneered a work together, which is wonderful because you've done it all in cyberspace. And that's quite remarkable in itself, thinking about our creating a new future. I think it would be appropriate that we start such a universal conversation with the story of the paw. Jean?
Well, I am a dog person. I consider myself at least half dog. I was literally raised by a dog, that's true. And so I trust what my dogs do. And this big golden doodle named Habibi, which means sweetie pie in Arabic, started to go to the corner of a room and paw away at the rug, just pawed and pawed. Habibi, come on, stop that, stop it. No. So I figured, found a mouse or something. I went over, I lifted up the rug, and there was a scientific paper written by Anneloes. And I read it, and it was about how the future is a reality. Time, past, present, future are simultaneous, in the new physics. It's a reality that also can affect the present. I thought, whoa, that's right up my. And so I got in touch with her immediately, and we immediately went to work. It's been, 17 months, something like that, every day on Zoom. We have never met. We don't know when we're ever going to meet, given the current world. But we were two souls on the same wavelength. And so even though she's a good 40 years younger than I am, so what?
Chronologically.
But anyway, so that's how it started.
That's so interesting.
But it was a dog that did it.
It was a dog. You were brought together by a dog. And a big wow. It's funny, you bring up that you've never met, but in fact, you've met for 17 months, except not in physical reality. But you've met, you're now intimate in your understanding of each other's hearts and minds and souls.
Well, it's the new world religion, Mitchell, Zoomism.
That's right, exactly. And it works quite well with Buddhism and Sufism. I accept.
Buddha would have been so pleased.
Yes, indeed. So no, that's just, it's a beautiful story and beginning. You spoke of the quest of the Rose, that's of Rose, I'm sorry, who is the featured protagonist. And, very clearly you used narrative and storytelling, which, Jean, of course, is your, the blood running through your veins, to convey a series of profound principles that are embedded, and you know it so well, Anneloes, in our current scientific story. And could you talk a little bit about that, and what process you both went through to come up with this trilogy, and what to bring forth first? I mean, I think that would be a bit challenging in itself, quite honestly.
You're asking me, right?
I am, yeah.
Yeah, okay, good.
A big question, actually.
Wow, we can go over the whole program with that.
Yeah.
But exactly as Jean was saying, when we were really going into the heart of reality itself and exploring, some of these groundbreaking new ideas that are emerging from the new paradigm sciences, we realized this needs a story and this needs a narrative. Because just speaking the narrative of unity and diversity, or evolutionary coherent complexity, or a unified reality of life, they sound like beautiful words and very poetic, and but it doesn't mean a lot for a lot of people. So it really needs to land, and this is where we really felt it needs to come alive in the questions of our time. It needs to come alive in the development that we're all going through. Also needs to come alive in how are we approaching the various challenges that are now upon us and also are increasing. So what we can see of this kind of new emerging narrative of the new paradigm sciences is this narrative of unity, is the understanding that the universe is really one single unified coherent being.
It's glad you used that word.
Exactly, not just an it that's held together by
that's part of the problem, that it's been conceived as an it, and that creates this distance and a sense of false, if you will, objectivity, when it's all truly a subjective space.
Exactly. And also understanding what even subjective means in that. So it's a very much a narrative of relationship. And so we are living in a universe of interbeing, interdependence, interconnectedness, a universe that evolves also as us and through us. So we're part of its evolution. And that these deeper patterns of being and becoming, of growing and development, we're seeing them at all scales and levels of existence. And that's a very empowering narrative, of course, as well, because what it does, what it helps us to provide is also an understanding of the deeper architecture of life and why, by design, we've created trajectories of collapse. And by knowing what not to do, how not to create a world, then we start to see the ways of how instead to do it differently. How do we design for regeneration, for healing, for collaboration?
It's very much, the idea that we truly learn by contrast, even as children, don't touch that iron. Why, mommy? And, immediately we get the message, and it's verdandi. Jean, could you, you'll all know what that means soon after you get the book and read it. Could you speak to that idea? This is one of the things I'm truly perplexed by. You spoke about in the book, evolutionary coherence. What an elegant phrase. Yet when I look around at our human species, it looks like so many have fallen through the cracks, both on the evolutionary side and on the coherence side. How do you explain that?
All right. Well, if we could put you in a time travel suit and take you
I'm in
back.
one already.
Okay, well, then you know exactly what I'm about to say. And take you to other times of breakdown, say the 14th, 15th century, okay, in Europe. You would find so much collapse. You would find so much breakdown of all old ways of being, and you would find a pandemic of the Black Plague.
Isn't that interesting?
And over half of Europe died within a very short period of time. They didn't have a vaccine, you know.
Yes.
And then you would find that suddenly there begins to arise in special cities like Florence, Firenze, and also in Milan. You would find that people were opening up. It was a whole new wave of knowing and feeling and creation was sparking in people's minds and souls. And you have, within a short period of time, you have Leonardo creating
Renaissance.
Rinascita in Italian. What a great name.
Vabbè.
Yes, renewal, radical renewal, regeneration, and a new kind of coherence of mind, of spirit, of creativity. It was almost as if the universe herself, in her infinite wisdom, was allowing for either a download of things to come or an activation of these potent knowings that had been latent in the human psyche, however it works, probably both ways.
Yes.
And that's where evolutionary coherence began to come together with the necessity of the time. It's not, I'm talked about the 14th, 15th century, but you would find it in many other, not many other, but at least a dozen that I can think of, times where these similar things happen. We're in evolutionary times. We're in times trying to find the coherence with the depth and the potency of what we are capable of. That's why the poet says, the human heart can go to the lengths of God. Dark and cold we may be, but this is no winter now. The frozen misery of centuries cracks, breaks, begins to move. The thunder is the thunder of the flood, the flow, the upstart, spring. Thank God our time is now, when wrong comes up to meet us everywhere, never to leave us till we take the longest stride of soul folk ever took. That's where we are, my friend. We're in the longest stride of soul, and that's evolutionary coherence.
And just to add to that, Regina's saying, yeah,
bellissima. Grazie.
So what is Rose in our story, who is the young woman, and Verdandi is her grandmother.
Yes, Rose.
Yes, Rose was trained originally as a biologist. So she learned to recognize the different patterns of nature, yes, and then to how to apply that to our own life and world. And so when she started to discover evolutionary coherent growth in nature, she noticed there was a distinct pattern. The forest can become more diverse with many more different plants and species and trees, and yet it doesn't start to compete against itself. It doesn't kill itself. So the diversity is evolutionary coherent in the sense that it's collaborative and it adds to the intelligence and the wisdom and the resilience of a forest. And then she said, but that's strange. If we're looking at our human development and growth patterns, we have the same desire, evolutionary impulse, to diversify and become more complex over time. Yet what's different between us and a forest is that as soon as human diversity starts to increase, it becomes more competitive, infighting, polarization, division. And so she wondered, why is that happening? And could it be that we have let go of being co-coherent with the natural growth patterns of life? And thus we have created these divisive economic, cultural, political, and social systems.
Beautifully put, beautifully put. Still underneath, there is, let me say this, I want to bring to bear some of the newer discoveries in neuroscience and neuropsychology, which argues against the idea of the competitive nature of man. And this is the way I represent it to myself, and I'd love to hear you both weigh in on this. And this, of course, has to do with some faulty understanding of Darwin. But for the moment, I look at this as largely as brain developments, meaning that our competitive nature which has a survival aspect to it, is really eclipsed, if you will, by cooperation, bonding, oxytocin release, love, storytelling. All the arts come in around the bonfire to keep people warm and warm-hearted. And it's people's relationship with each other and the bonding that takes place that lets us forage in the forests, get through the hard, difficult winters that Jean was speaking so eloquently of just now, and deal with predators. It was not man against man, if you will, but rather man with man and woman to work collaboratively. And the science shows, and in fact, Lynn McTaggart, dear friend as well, who wrote the beautiful foreword to the book, was one of the people who has taught me this in her books, The Bond and others. She's been one of the sources. So it's so interesting. We have these two parallel isms, if you will, that are running side by side, and they're entirely different. Jean, could you speak to that?
Well, one thing I'm going to challenge you, my friend.
Please.
Because what you have just said is so important. Yet if I turn on the news now, after this show, yes, I'm going to be listening and hearing one terrible thing after the other, true which enough. Then collapses the coherence, if you will.
Yes.
And makes me think of what can I do? What can I do? And it makes me stupid. The mind then narrows and loses the efficacy of its own evolutionary power, you see. So what you have just said.
Contract instead of expand.
That's right. We live in a state of a spectrum of chronic contraction and fearfulness that comes in through the media, which we never had to this, well, never to this degree before.
Yes.
So, and that's why we believe that, and it's the reason why I think ultimately, Anneloes, why we wrote this book. Something had to be said in terms of science, art, spirit, and so many other of the great ideologies of possibility, to show that we do have a way through, not a way out. We have to change the out and open up more doors.
Companies go. I get it. Yes.
Yeah. And so the book itself, as you know, is a process. It's a teaching. It's a training. It is a evocation. It's a lure of a new becoming. So that in reading the book, this is, I think it's one of its main powers.
Yes.
People themselves are going through the exercises that are subtly woven through the book. They are becoming the main characters. They are opening up to a new agenda of possibility, and hopefully one that transforms and helps them go beyond the everyday news, which is based on selling papers or products and getting people hooked in a rather barbaric way. We really need profoundly new ways of education. It's an education. The book itself is an education, and it is even a rinashita, a rebirth of the human being in the process of reading these things. And even if they don't understand the language right now, they, with all the exercises, something in them, as we have discovered, wakes up. And they begin to form, as Anneloes and I were discussing early this morning, they begin to form new communities of practice spontaneously to keep this going. Because you don't just do it on yourself. It's not the flight of the alone to the alone. It's the flight of the self to the many, the manyness in within oneself and the manyness outside of oneself.
Beautifully put, beautifully put. It's building community. And in fact, it should be said to the viewers and listeners that this is both intellectually enlivening as well as experientially.
Yes, it's an experiential book.
And I think that that's just one of the merits. In fact, the first question I intended to ask, but of course, man plans and God laughs. We have the structure of the book itself, which is, of course, this beautiful narrative of storytelling about people, which warms the heart and engages us emotionally in what is also this powerful intellectual exercise of understanding non-locality and evolutionary coherence and the other principles that you both make a very a strong point about elucidating through the book. And it brings the exercises forward where people really go through, and both an imaginative and, in fact, this is what I'd like to hear you both speak about next, imaginal experience. Anneloes, could you describe the distinction between these two for us?
Of course, my pleasure. So people are more commonly used to the word imaginative rather than imaginal. And so the imaginative often remains in the level of the mind, sometimes can be used also to describe something that borderlines on fantasy. And trust me, this is not a fantasy. Whereas the imaginal, it includes the imaginative and creative capacities and also the visionary capacity, but it goes much further by extending our own transformative capacities to the transformative capacities of the universe itself. And this is when we are then entering into what we call the non-local realm of consciousness, which is imaginal by nature, and meaning that that's a dimension within consciousness itself where the future lives, and where systems and life and each of us can tap into in order to renew ourselves from higher and deeper, more implicate orders of reality. So it's not a renewal by repeat. It's not a, oh, this program that's broke down, so let's restart it just like it was before.
That's right.
You're going to simply, repair. No, this is about renewal in a way that's transformative and thus evolutionary, because it accesses future potentials that have not yet been made manifest from higher and more deeper implicate orders of reality, which are non-local, in order then to be able to localize those, bring them into space and time, and therefore giving rise to whole new possibilities of what it means to be human and how to grow and develop and evolve our world.
Beautiful, beautiful. No, it's very interesting. It also outlines the difference between what you could call horizontal reality and vertical, on one level, one way of describing it. Okay. Meaning in this case, you're not going to just change the light bulb. You're going to come up with an entirely new way of radiating light.
Well, that's dear old Bucky Fuller again, my old friend.
Yeah.
When I went
in reality and new.
That's right. When I went complaining to him about something, oh, Jane, stop complaining, build a better model. And that's really what the book is about. It's about the build of a better model.
It's in honor of Bucky Fuller in some real way, I have that beautiful quote in my electronic signature on all the emails. And then I have another one, by the way, of your other mother, Margaret Mead, about who it is that actually changes the world. It's a small group of committed citizens, not the world at large, so to speak, So that's just some synchronicity between us yet again, Jean. So I want to just also bring up the subject of COVID, because you use that as your launching pad. It's very au courant, if you will. Obviously, it's the time of our era. It's our modern plague, if you will. Yes. As you were referring to the parallel between now and 14th, 15th centuries. You also dive right in headlong into the domain of life and death. It's like we start there. We started that twilight zone, that interdimensionality. Anneloes, could you speak to that for a moment?
Yes, because when Rose, as the story starts, is actually in the hospital dying with COVID, because he has a very rapid and fast immune system, overreacting, and which are preceded by dreams that he'd had but didn't understand, whereby 3 monsters would be coming, jumping on the path, and then somebody from the bushes would come with a knife and cut off the head. And she's like, what is this? And every time she'd had that dream, she would have a very high fever. And she only discovers later that the 3 corona spikes, when one of them interlocks into the body, and our immune system responds by cutting off the head. That's how the how the virus gets inside and multiplies. So she's experiencing the impact of the virus within herself on multiple levels, again, in the imaginal, as well as physically, and in a near-death situation where she's then hospitalized. And then she has to find a way to not only heal herself, but also to change her relationship with the virus for it to become symbiotic. And she finds that she can't do that from the consciousness inside herself that's dying. So she had an intuition already for a while that there's a stage of her life that's coming to an end, and that it's not coming to another bend to another way. And she says, how can this be? Is my life ending? I'm so young. This can't be. Universe, please help me. And then she discovers that there is a new cycle of time, a new creative cycle that is being born that she can be part of by making a conscious choice. And by making this conscious choice from her future potential of this new cycle. So this is not the future potential of her past. It's not a future past. It's a future of a new beginning, of a new cycle, a new journey. And it's through that, by accessing that choice, by accessing that consciousness, going beyond the veils, that's what's required. So she's really dying to her old self, dying to her old life, yes? It is then that she discovers also how to shift the relationship with the virus for it to become symbiotic and no longer a threat. And she realizes then how our own immune system was also weaponizing it, and how that's been a pattern of humanity again and again, that we weaponize what we do not understand. We polarize what we are afraid of. And so she discovers a fundamental new pattern then.
That is profound, and I think essentially important understanding of beginning to shed light on this thing called a virus, this thing called a pandemic, and our way through, separate and apart from the things that are also called vaccines, and even all of the natural remedies that I happen to be particularly fond of. It is an entirely different way of regarding what this is. It's a shift in consciousness, which gives us a new start, and it's with a viral inception. And if you look at our friends, Gene, like Bruce Lipton, who I've interviewed so many times I can't remember, and your friend who said that a virus is like a thumb drive. It's not what we think, and it's not animate. It's information. And that actually speaks to a whole other character, important one of your book, that I know got brought forward through our another dear friend, Jude Curran, who in her understanding of cosmology and the nature of reality speaks, of course, of informational fields and systems. And that is even, because I spoke with her about this a number of times, it's not energy as the fundamental aspect of reality, but rather information. And so it took me a little shifting to get on that. COVID, virus, it's literal reality, and the way the immune system is programmed, if you will, per our consciousness. And what happened with Rose, and please correct me if my understanding isn't right on, with her dying and going into another state and receiving whatever download she did about, if you will, the nature of reality. When she came back, it was what you would both call, we would call an imaginal occurrence. So she wasn't just continuing the same sequence of Rose as she had been, but rather stepped up to an entire other evolutionary plane.
Right. Yeah.
So that reset her immune system, which had her, if you will, befriend the virus instead of it being polar opposite.
I think what you're saying is so important, because you're really talking about what is a potential happening on the earth at this time. And that is where we have the virus and the equivalence of the virus in, let's say, authoritarian leaderships all over the world, which are themselves figural viruses in the political sphere.
Yes.
And they pop up so that we can take the evolutionary journey and do something about it. But you see, the do something about it is still way off in the shade. What I think happens in this book, and will happen, by the way, in future books, where we're going to become much more explicit about this, is that people realize that they have within them, as part of the deep-seated but very powerful human potential, to look at things in a totally different way, as Rose does in an altered state. So it takes a different state of consciousness, not just your everyday,
Sure.
but a different state of consciousness can look and work with issues so as to bring about healing, to bring about making things whole, to bring about a whole new sensibility of creating a world and a self that works. Ultimately, this is what our trilogy is about: the creation of a world and a self that works, by being able to see that we have orchestra. It's like music. It's like Bach, actually. We have access to the flipping or the regeneration or the shifting of the notes of our life into a new kind of harmonics, so that we get well, for our societies begin to move into societies that are interrelated, collaborative, and work. It's really a study in whole system transition, by actualizing parts of ourselves that have always been there, but that we had forgotten we had.
The forgotten organs. Yeah, no, I mean, and that harkens back, of course, to your life work in human potential, and of course, the potential and possible human. And I've said to people for so long, even when I first heard the phrase human potential as a wee lad, I thought, you know, that's not more memorizing. That's not more book learning. That's a whole other dimension of our mind, psyche, soul that is able to emerge. So I kind of recognize that as I say, a wee lad, and I've been nurturing it ever since. And I actually had a lot of input from the fellow who funded the Institute of Noetic Sciences, Paul Temple, way back in the 1970s when I took his daughter to the senior prom. One of the other benefits, I loved her so much, but I also loved him, and he was sort of like a father to me in many ways in the space of teaching me about parapsychology. And I took that as a stepping stone into these other potentials, Jean, that you have been so eloquent about for so long.
You mentioned the Institute for Noetic Sciences, which began in my living room many years ago, because
surprise, surprise.
Ed Mitchell came and stayed with us for about a week. And to say, what shall I do? What shall I do? I'm so full of ideas. What shall I do? So what we did is not have the usual conversation. We put him into trance.
Oh.
Come into my house, why am I going to trance? But we put him into another state of being.
Sure.
He not only remembered what he saw, from outer space and on the moon,
right,
but he also remembered, if you will, his body-mind system to effect an open door to a future of what human beings and the earth could be. So it became much, much larger than the initial wish to just remember what he saw on the moon.
Yeah, exactly.
That began, and he did very well by it.
Yes, indeed. I'm so glad I brought this up. I never knew that wrinkle in the story. That's just, it stands to reason. It stands to reason. If you ever have a question about anything, Anneloes, and you want to know the origin of something, speak to Verdandi. She knows. No, But let's go back, if you will. And of course, I want to hear anything each of you wants to share here. But I'm particularly moved by this idea of the virus as metaphor for world change, but actually more than change, because that could be considered a horizontal, just like you were saying earlier, Anneloes, about changing a computer chip. No, 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 no. We're talking about having an entirely multidimensional computer chip next round, so that's the verticality. So there is a sense that we could really rise from the ashes, or I like the Buddhist image of lotus emerging from the mud, because indeed we're all very muddy these days. Could you talk to that aspect of the book and how that can help move us forward?
Yes, but also to go back to the virus, when you look at the process of metamorphosis, then you see that the viruses play a critical role to support the dissolution also of the old caterpillar body, turning it into a nutrient soup, together, of course, with the enzymes that are being released. But so that the imaginal cells of the butterfly coats can start to organize and link up to be forming also the imaginal organs in an imaginal body for the butterfly being. So there's so many metaphors in that. So what we are seeing therefore is that these viruses, they are actually starting to come in and almost like, sometimes they could have been dormant, but activate in these times of major, major transformation. What is particular of this time, and therefore what we're emphasizing so strongly in our story, is that the change is happening in something that is dying and collapsing. So there's not a neat process right now. Oh, we're going to complete that chapter of our human life, and then we have this nice time out, and then we'll figure out how to create a new system. No, we really have
messy.
to. It's messy. It's messy, and
it's like childbirth.
Well, exactly, because for the baby to emerge, it's a bloody process as well, right? For the cervix to be able to open up. Yeah. Exactly. So, and in fact, I experienced that very strongly in giving birth to 2 boys, and how that moment when the baby starts to emerge and the cervix, the birth canal opens up, it's like the portal to death and life. It's one portal. It's one portal. It's not 2. So there's a life for that little baby that's dying, and for the mother too, because in that moment you become a mother. You're born to be a mother. The baby births your motherhood.
Oh yes, right.
Yeah. So one life is ending, and a new life is being born. So this money process of everything that happens at the roots of the lotus is very important in our trilogy. And it also, because it sets up a different expectation also of this time, and to keep seeking for what is the new that is seeking to emerge, what are these future potentials, and also to understand that this influx of imaginal energy, this influx of imaginal power in times of breakdown, how we can work with that. And if we don't, guess who's going to work with that? These radical parties, extremists, because they know how to capture that imaginal power and get people attracted to the wrong story. So it's incredibly important that we respond in this time to the impulse for renewal in a way that's imaginal and not just rational, because otherwise we are missing a major, major opportunity for transformation, and we're actually feeding the radicalization and the polarization of those people who try to hijack that transformative.
That's right. In fact, you're reminding me of one of the parts of the book that really hit me, which had to do with the discussion of polarity and the entry of a third aspect, which of course is an archetype throughout all great wisdom traditions, religions, from the Trinity to Hindu and the Upanishads. There's always a threesome, if you will, triangulation in some cases, but it's always this unified field of three, yin, yang, and then li, the line between the two that conjoins and unifies. Jean, how do we use that principle to unify the mess we have now?
You're asking ultimate questions. I don't know that I can give ultimate.
I'm an ultimate kind of guy, and so are you.
You certainly are, yeah. But I will tell a story I've told a number of times recently that I think illumines this. Okay. When I was 8 years old, I went to PS6. I don't know if you remember PS6. It was a tremendous experimental school at that time.
Upper East Side.
And they took, yeah, on the Upper East Side of 86th Street and Madison Avenue. And they took us to meet the great elders of the time. And my class, fourth grade class.
Einstein. I smell Einstein.
That's right. And they took us across we took boats, we took buses, and we went to Princeton. And we sat in on a room that was just chalkboards with lots of equations in it. And Mr. Einstein, Dr. Einstein came in. Yeah, what do you want? He had lots of hair. He was very sweet. He had done 2 different color socks, you know.
Like a good physicist should.
That's it, guys. And one of our really smart aleck boys, little boys, said, Mr. Einstein, how can we get to be as smart as you? He said, read fairy tales. We did not like that answer at all. Another smart aleck boy said, well, Mr. Einstein, how can we get to be smarter than you? Read more fairy tales. Woo, you know. So afterwards, I got to corner him and say, Mr. Einstein, you're talking about imagination, aren't you? Yeah, yeah. He says, you know, I'm not much of a mathematician. My students do the work, but I have great imagination. I get on the light beam and I ride it through space. I mean, he was very, very eloquent and activated. Now, what he was also talking about, I realized just from as I remember the images he used, he was talking about imagination as a path to the imaginal, because the imaginal contains the codes and the codes of the architecture of the way everything works. He snapped into the codes, beginning with imagination, getting into the great codes, which are the imaginal, which are the potent powers of how things work and yet can be, in which past, present, future are simultaneous in the code, you see, in the imaginal. And, you know, and I realized when subsequently being able to study other very interesting people like that. I mean, obviously Margaret Mead and Joseph Campbell, and goes on and on. Teilhard, who I walked with, of course, I was quite young at that time.
Benches in Central Park.
Yeah, so you know my life. But lots of names of people who are not well known, but who were breakthrough people because they began imaginatively and they ended up imaginally. We are coded beings. We are coded with just about all the knowledge that we need, all the potencies. It's not even knowledge, it's pre-knowledge, but the potencies that can then quake and shiver and begin to emerge is not just a new ideas, but new ways of being. So it isn't just an intellectual process. In fact, it's probably not an intellectual process at all. It is a psychophysical, psychohistorical process that says, okay, chum, you're ready. Here are the openings, go for it. Now, if you really begin to teach in that manner, evoke in that manner, call forth in that manner, then you begin to have not so much answers, you actually have whole living theater, a living theater of situations that turns the page on the old forms and opens up to a rinashita, a renaissance, that the cosmos says, hot dog, I got a live one there, and opens up to you and opens you up.
So to go further on, so what
I realize that what you're really speaking about is, I just realized it's a psychophysical Sicilian system for immortality.
Hey, bravo,
That's
Carl.
what it is. That's what is on the base of this book.
Tante belle cose. So many beautiful things.
Grazie. You know, that was kind of funny though, right? A Sicilian system of immortality. It's it. It's this elixir, and it's got meatballs in it. Anneloes, please.
Yeah, you were asking about.
I can't resist. I'm sorry. You know, Sicilian, New York, Jewish. I can't resist. And neither can your dog.
So you were
Anneloes,
asking
please.
how the Trinity can help the unity. Okay. So yes, in alchemy, there's the old principle, the triunity, which will tell you what looks one is three in aspect. Now, when we are looking at, again, these dominant human systems, not the indigenous, but the dominant human systems, then we see that they are dualized by design. So you have to choose. It's either this or that. Now, the Trinity, so the triunity principles helps us to understand that behind the appearance of what may appear dual or two, there is always a third principle, and there's a common unity. So it's helping to understand that what becomes two or later can multiply further. It has a common unity, so that is the origin of the Trinity, but it also has an evolutionary direction, namely that the two becomes a new one. It forms a new one. Even if we're looking at our own body, we will see there are places where consciousness enters. We see the two going to the one. We see the glands, again, the two going to one. We have one mouth. We have the ears, the eyes. You see, then again, two breasts, your navel. And so you see this entire structure.
Threes are everywhere.
The threes are everywhere. So the threes are in this configuration. They're also in that configuration. Now, the problem with humanity is that we have only looked at hierarchical system, right? That we become addicted to that. What we have forgotten is the other Trinity, which is the womb, what we're talking about.
I was about to say it's the divine feminine and the actual feminine.
That's it. And how they both work together. So it's both the receptive as well as the active manifesting. So the Trinity principle is incredibly important. And the third way perspectives for being able to facilitate the healing of all that's become polarized, all that's become divided, to start to, for people to understand there's this and that and more. There's a new evolutionary perspective that can only open up and become experiential when we can bring into this conversation this and that and that and that, and what can emerge from the new way of being in that togetherness.
It sounds so beautiful. It reminds me also of some study I did many years ago of George Ivanovich Gurdjieff and the law of three, which is, again, just a reiteration of the same principle, you know, and the work of Uspensky, et cetera. So it's everywhere. And basically, and this is one of the other subjects in the book that's described so beautifully, is sacred geometry. So that on one hand, you know, on some level, you were using, Anneloes, the image of deeper harmonics. Needless to say, that brings forward the music of the spheres, the music of life as music, and as a deeper harmonic, and the mathematics underlying music. I mean, and so it's both the digital numbers, numerals, if you will, in particular formulaic relationship, and geometrical patterns.
Exactly.
And put them together, and you get that elixir called life.
That's it. And the geometry of space-time itself, so that the geometry of space-time itself is fractally repeated within our inner architecture and becomes almost like the ground foundations for self-conscious experience and even choice itself, the capacity to make choice as consciousness. So this geometry is not just nice looking, it's fundamental to the experience of consciousness.
So we are actually cosmic agents.
Yes.
We're actually in the same patterning as the cosmos. wrapped up in a biodegradable space-time suit. And that is really one of the major points of the book, wouldn't you say, Anneloes?
I would.
That
I would too.
yes, because it is that we have access that we had, maybe certain shamans or mystics knew this in some way or other through the veils of their culture, but we now know it with an explicitness that we never could have had before this time. Now, what do we do with it? How do we work with it? Because, when I look at, as someone who's been fascinated by cultural history, when I look at where we are, there's a lot of dead ends, are there not? There's a lot of walls, so to speak. But when we know ourselves as cosmic agents, carrying the architecture of the cosmos, carrying the realities that are desiring to be made manifest in the space-time matrix, then there is an enormous hope for us. And that's also a critical part of what the book is and what it does to the reader.
Yeah, beautifully put. I mean, it sort of conjures the phenomenon today having to do with extraterrestrial life, intelligent life on other planets. And I'd like to bring forward Jung's idea of the UFO, which, involves at least our looking outward. And he didn't say they're there or not there. That wasn't actually his purpose, but that symbolically, there is a higher level of consciousness, of intelligence, and we could best imagine it, if you will, outside of ourselves, because we can do that. But it's also simultaneously, as the point you keep making, Jean, about cosmic agent, inside ourselves. So I would love to hear you comment a bit on this phenomenon happening at this time when we're being told about this pandemic. We're being told that our liberties and freedoms are being seriously delimited, and at the same time, a potential for freedom and of universal identity, cosmic identity, is before us like never before.
I want you to continue to spiel on this. You're getting to something that's very, very important, and I don't know you've ever said it. Just keep talking. It's very important. I'm good about these things. I do recognize the breakthroughs when they happen.
Okay, I'll do my best.
Very important.
Yeah, okay. What I'm saying is that there is it's as though we're coming to a certain point in history, which, by the way, is giving birth to the imaginal, the caterpillar to the butterfly.
Good.
And it's almost as though we have to reach our nadir to reach the acme. And so what that means in this case is, by being so delimited consciously, our liberties that we have taken for granted in democracy, etc., are being literally taken away. And it's with this wonderful smiley face that we're doing this for your good. I don't know, it seems to harken back to some days in the 1930s and 40s in Germany to me. And that's not just because I have Jewish blood in my veins. I think any person looking in could see that. So on one hand, there's this constraint before us and on us. And at the same time, it's as though we're about to burst through to an entirely new level of consciousness. And the UFO is a metaphor for that and might actually be friendly with us. I kind of was on a few UFO panels not long ago with the Evolutionary Leaders Group and all. And one of the comments I made was, not only is this a very exciting potential adventure, because I feel we need to control the narrative of all of this for lots of reasons, but it also opens up a whole new dimension for Match.com.
Yes, indeed, I should say. Who or what it is are you really appropriate for? It may not be on this earth at this time. There are a lot of women would agree with that.
That woman, she's out of this world.
Now, you mentioned that you're Jewish, so let's go into ancient Judaism. Go into the Kabbalah, which is a book of knowings at multiple levels. I'm sure you've done some work on that. if you look at a Kabbalistic interpretation of Genesis, the open lines of Genesis, in Hebrew, Bershit bara Elohim, Bershit. It's not, it's patterns, it's creative cosmic patterns. Bara, into creation.
Aleph Bet.
By alpha, yes, alphabet. By the Elohim. Now, the Elohim itself, every letter was so important. What is it? Aleph, Lamed, Hey, Yod, Mem, Aleph, the immeasurable creative potency, the cosmic knower,
Yeah.
Aleph. Lamed is a channel, a sluice way. Sluice into life. Lamed, Hey is life. Yod, and we are the interactive local humans, cosmic agents of the Aleph. So Aleph, Bar, Yod is us, Mem in the biosphere. Patterns of creation by the immense potencies of knowledge, of knowing that is being carried into life in ourselves as we begin to create and recreate the biosphere. I mean, that's just the opening. I could do you a whole thing on Genesis.
That's just the first line.
Yes, that's right. Now, what that is, it's interesting, these ancient mystical books, of which Anneloes also has profound knowledge of, they were people who had the quiet and the time for quiet and deepening that really understood the structure, the architecture, the dynamics, the spirit of creation itself. I bring this up since you're Jewish, because this is really the telling point of where we are now. It's actually God University, because really what it is, how to create a world,
Yes.
Course one, and
yes.
we may be at God University.
101. Yep.
Go,
Yep.
But how do we raise ourselves to our own sense of the dynamic of which we are now a part? We are co-creators, and co-creators always come along, as in Renaissances, at the most difficult and dangerous times of history. And we're being invited to the great play of co-creation. But we don't know it. Now, what do we need? Do we need a new religion? I don't think so. It's not religio to the old forms, but it certainly is an aesthetic spirituality, spiritual artistry, I would say. It's both social artistry combined with spiritual artistry, then becomes the momentum and the magnificence and the intelligence to go into the act of co-creation,
Yeah, I do.
Bershit bara Elohim.
Or in another favorite language of ours, NRK halogos.
Yes, of course. Yeah. And also
Although I prefer the Hebrew, I love the Greek.
Well, I as a descendant of the Greeks, Sicilians, that's what we were. It is, you see, people who had time and could then deepen into the fullness and the functioning and the genius and the soupiness and the weirdness of reality itself.
Yes.
They had time to bring it into a new kind of food for the world. We don't have the time because we are compelled to watch screens. And this has taken out an inherent genius that was ours and was right for our time. Again, in the book, what we're trying to do is lure people away from the media and into the métier, the deeper matter of what we really are.
Yes. Mater. Also.
Mother. Hey, mama.
Hey.
So two ladies had to write the book.
Of course. Right. One had to be Italian.
Sicilian had to be a real mother.
Perdone.
Listen, I'm also half Scotch, so you should know that. We don't talk about that.
I overlooked that.
So you brought up three patterns. You brought up a pattern whereby, just as we're about to expand into a new sense of identity and story, there is also this backlash of contraction of old systems and identities.
Yes.
That's a recurring pattern, by the way. Many people will tell you just before a breakthrough, often you find there's something happening in your life that you go, really? And it
In
feels like
homeopathy, it's called a retracing.
yeah,
Right?
exactly.
You get that? It goes back and it
That's it.
reiterates.
And it's almost like in order to strengthen our inner strength and resolve for really going to that next level, right, which is much more expensive. So there is that pattern. You're also talking about the readiness of time in terms of our human development for being able to communicate with intelligences other than ourselves, which I would say applies not just to our stellar visitors, but also to the trees, the myopic systems, the biome, planetary biome. So it's at all levels, by understanding what you were bringing up earlier. Reality is information, like Jude so beautifully said. So that's the second strand. And the other is, of course, the perspective. Is it new?
Yes.
Throughout our human stories, and especially in indigenous cosmologies, they always talked about stellar ancestors. So the time in human history where we made ourselves the center of the universe is actually very short relative to the stories whereby we've always accepted that these human-centric notions of the cosmos and the universe is rather infantile.
Anneloes, you're making me feel much better now. Now that I understand the dot on the page that keeps us as egocentric in the universe. Yeah, no, I'm being playful, but you're absolutely right. If you go back to the Australian Aborigines, who for 40,000 years, and the Siberian shamans, maybe 35,000 years. I mean, there is a long history of humanity and the species doing amazing things on this planet with a proper native indigenous organic understanding. And then bloop, something happened. That's why I was referring early in this interview about there seems to be a bunch of people that fell through the cracks of creating a coherent and evolutionary universe. They've lost the way. And unfortunately, we're running out of time. I mean, you two are masters of time. Couldn't you not talk to Zoomisms and do something? Your book points the way. And while it has an intellectual and spiritual richness that is beyond so much, and I really look forward to continuing this dialogue or trialogue with the two of you. I would also like to just say that it's got a ground to it. High and lofty as it is on one level, you also make sure that through the exercises, it's experiential, and it's taking a good, hard, cold look at the reality of ecosystem collapse, of moral collapse. And I want to just congratulate you on that level for not just going into the spheres, but staying at the biosphere and the actual life at home. It's important to say that heaven and earth combination is what we really need. So I thank you both so much for your beautiful work. Cyberspace, I want to also thank in this interview, which allowed us to convene from across the world, as well as for allowing the two of you to commune together over the last 17 months and put together this book and trilogy for our future as humans. So thank you again,
so much.
Justin.
Thank you.
Anneloes.
Thank you so much, Mitchell. Thank you.